Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're diving deep into Ian W. Toll's monumental work, The Conquering Tide. War in the Pacific Islands, 1942-1944.
It really is monumental. This is the second volume, and it picks up right after, the really big turning points of Pearl Harbor and Midway.
Exactly.
And it covers this incredibly intense period, mid-1942 to mid-1944, basically ending with Japan's big strategic loss in the Marianas. Toll just does a fantastic job showing how everything shifted in those 2 years.
He really does. So our mission today really is to pull out the key insights, the main nuggets of knowledge from this amazing book. We're going to try and look at it from, well, all sides, Allied, Japanese, home front, battlefront.
High command versus the guy on the ground, too.
Absolutely. The high command and the individual soldier. It's about understanding not just what happened, but, why it mattered so much, the ripple effects.
Right. And to kind of give you a handle on this, we've pulled out 5 core themes that just jump out from Toll's narrative. We'll sort of weave these through as we go chronologically. First up is the war's shifting momentum. How that tide really turned. From Japan looking almost unstoppable to the Allies starting these relentless counteroffensives across huge distances. We'll even pinpoint that moment where the Allies thought, okay, we're not just holding on anymore, we're actually pushing back.
That's crucial. Then the second theme, the unseen battle of logistics and innovation. This is huge in Toll's book.
Oh, massive.
The sheer, almost unbelievable challenge of supplying a war thousands of miles from anywhere. And the solutions they came up with, some brilliant, some, well, not so brilliant.
Like building airstrips out of coconuts, literally. Or those faulty torpedoes
Yeah,
we get into.
definitely getting to those.
Yeah.
Okay, third theme.
Command, control, and conflict. This covers the intense rivalries within the commands, both Allied and Japanese. Personality clashes, inter-service fighting.
Army versus Navy is a classic one there.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is Toll shows how these weren't just, petty arguments. They actually shaped major decisions, sometimes disastrously. Delays, bad calls made because of who was arguing with whom.
Right. And number 4, we have to talk about the human experience of total war.
Absolutely vital.
The physical grind, the psychological impact on everyone involved soldiers, sailors, airmen, and what was happening on the home fronts too, which was unique on both sides, plus how propaganda was shaping what people believed. We really want to get at what it felt like to be there, the terror, but also just the day-to-day reality.
And that leads right into the final theme, the dehumanizing power of propaganda, how each side painted the enemy. This led to, fanatical determination on one side.
And on the other, sometimes a really shocking disregard for life. It's pretty confronting stuff.
It is. So, that's the plan. Let's dive in, starting around mid-1942.
Okay, so Toll sets the scene brilliantly. He talks about the Pacific landscape, like the Solomon Islands. These weren't just empty islands, they were British protectorates. There was this sort of Pax Britannica, a relative peace imposed by colonial rule.
And the local populations.
Initially, Toll says they were kind of overawed by Western technology. But many proved incredibly loyal to the British. There's that famous phrase, "me stop long, you fella," meaning I'm staying with you, I'm on your side.
And that loyalty became incredibly important because the initial shock of Japanese military success was just immense.
Oh, absolutely. Singapore falling so fast. And then the sinking of the Prince of Wales and repulse off Malaya, that was huge.
A real turning point, wasn't it? First time capital ships at sea were sunk just by aircraft. It completely upended naval thinking. And Japanese ground tactics, too, flanking, infiltration, caught the Allies totally flat-footed.
Meanwhile, back in the States, particularly Washington, D.C., Toll paints this picture of, frankly, chaos. A massive population explosion. They were throwing up these temporary buildings, tempos, everywhere, even along the reflecting pool.
Trying to cope with the bureaucracy of war.
Exactly, a huge housing crisis. But you also had Roosevelt, with his very assertive style. Toll calls him a pig-headed Dutchman, at times driving things forward. He even had that replica of Churchill's map room set up in the White House. Very hands-on.
But that hands-on approach didn't stop the infighting, did it? The inter-service rivalries.
Not at all. Toll highlights the constant rancor between the U.S. Army and Navy. Secretary of War Stimson had that amazing line about the Navy sometimes retiring from the realm of logic into a dim religious world.
Wow. That sums it up.
Doesn't it? They were blaming each other for everything, like the air defense failures at Pearl Harbor, even something like the Doolittle raid, which needed Army-Navy cooperation.
Army bombers off a Navy carrier.
Right. Even that got picked apart internally afterwards for how it was run. These weren't small disagreements. They had real strategic weight.
And it wasn't just U.S. services fighting. Toll mentions the British chiefs, like Alan Brooke, being really suspicious of Admiral King. They thought he was totally biased toward the Pacific, trying to pull resources away from Europe.
Despite the official Europe First policy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And General Marshall getting frustrated with the British focus on the Mediterranean, calling it a suction pump, diverting forces from the main invasion of France. You really see these high-level tensions shaping the whole war effort.
Meanwhile, on the Japanese side, their naval thinking was still dominated by this Zengen Sakusen idea.
Explain that a bit.
It's basically a strategy focused on attrition, wearing the enemy down bit by bit, aiming for one huge, decisive battleship showdown. Very Mahanian, influenced by the naval theorist Mahan.
The single knockout blow idea.
Exactly. And their key weapon for the attrition part was the Type 93 torpedo, the Long Lance. Phenomenal weapon. They planned to use devastating night torpedo attacks to weaken the U.S. fleet as it advanced across the Pacific, setting up that final battle.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now let's move into that brutal Guadalcanal campaign, August 42 to February 43. This is where all those themes really collide.
We really do. And you see that local loyalty factor immediately with Martin Clemens, the British official on Guadalcanal. Amidst panic among some white residents, he stayed, kept order, reassured the locals.
He stopped long, you fella.
Right. And crucially, he was the one who reported the Japanese were building an airstrip. That specific intelligence is what triggered the whole Allied invasion, Operation Watchtower. Shows you the power of good intel from the ground.
But launching that invasion, the logistical challenges for the Allies were just staggering. Admiral Gormley's command was facing critical shortages, fuel, ammo.
And just getting stuff there, building infrastructure, that's where the Seabees come in. Those Navy construction guys were miracle workers, literally building airstrips using crushed coral mixed with, yes, coconuts and local timber.
Under unbelievably primitive conditions. Toll really emphasizes this. Sometimes the whole effort would grind to a halt, waiting for just one spare part thousands of miles away. And they barely had maps, just a crude sketch from an old plantation boss initially.
And the command setup didn't help either. Toll calls the structure for Watchtower awkward and unwieldy. You had Gormley trying to run things from ashore, Admiral Fletcher commanding the carriers out at sea, leads to inevitable miscommunication.
Yeah. They did a rehearsal landing on Coro that went smoothly, but everyone knew the real thing would be different. Still, the actual landings on Guadalcanal and Tulagi, surprisingly okay at first.
Yeah, the Marines were psyched up for a bloodbath, but the initial opposition wasn't as fierce as they'd feared. Toll captures their mood, everything from stage fright to this surge of vitality, just being glad to be off the cramped, stinking transport ships. They were ready for a fight.
And then there were the Coast Watchers, unsung heroes, really.
Absolutely critical. Guys like Jack Reed, hidden up in Bougainville, radioing warnings about Japanese air raids coming down from Rabaul.
Giving Henderson Field, the airstrip, maybe an hour or two's notice.
Exactly. That happened consistently. Those warnings saved countless lives and planes throughout the whole Solomons campaign. Early warning was just as vital as fighters in the air.
But even with warnings, life on Guadalcanal, especially keeping that airstrip supplied, was a nightmare. Toll describes the beaches as totally congested. Supply dumps were just haphazard piles of stuff.
And constant air raids meant the supply ships couldn't just sit there and unload.
Yeah.
They had to keep moving, dodging bombs, wasting precious time.
It got so bad with aviation gasoline, they were flying it in using DC-3 cargo planes, barrel by barrel. Just desperate measures to keep the Cactus Air Force flying.
And then came Savo Island, August 9th, 1942. Toll doesn't mince words, calls it the worst defeat in U.S. naval history up to that point.
It's a really dark moment.
Pitch dark, moonless night.
Yeah.
Total confusion on the Allied side. Communication breakdowns, misidentifying Japanese float planes that were spotting for the cruisers.
And those Long Lance torpedoes.
Devastating. Just ripped through the Allied cruiser screen. 4 heavy cruisers sunk, 3 American, 1 Australian. The Marines ashore just couldn't believe it. What's happened to the Navy? That was the question on everyone's lips. And Fletcher pulling his carriers back early became hugely controversial. Vague orders, fear of losing the carriers. It showed how flawed command could lead to disaster.
Life on Henderson Field itself just became this relentless cycle of bombardment.
Yeah, Toll describes the near-daily midday raids from Japanese bombers and the harrowing nighttime bombardments from ships. And that one annoying float plane they nicknamed Washing Machine Charlie because of its engine sound.
Kept everyone totally sleep-deprived, nerves frayed.
Exactly. That October 14th naval bombardment was especially brutal. Wrecked a lot of the Cactus Air Force planes on the ground, and critically burned hundreds of drums of that precious aviation fuel. Toll talks frankly about combat fatigue, shell shock. The psychological cost was immense.
The Japanese weren't giving up, though. Yamamoto committed major naval forces for this Keigo operation.
Right. His main goal was still that decisive battle. He wanted to flush out and destroy the American aircraft carriers. That Mahanian obsession was still driving their strategy, even as the ground situation got tougher for them.
But Allied leadership changed. Gormley out, Halsey in, much more aggressive.
Yeah, Halsey flew straight into Guadalcanal, asked Van de Grift that famous question, "Can you hold?" He had this fiery public persona, kill more Japs. But Toll paints him as more complex. Publicly emotional, but strategically pretty sound. His arrival definitely boosted morale, even if some of his rhetoric was extreme.
So the naval battles continued. Santa Cruz.
October 42. Tactically, you could say Japan won. They sank the Hornet.
Right.
But strategically, it was an American win. Why? Because Japan lost far more experienced pilots and aircrew than the U.S. did. And they just couldn't replace them nearly as fast.
That became a recurring theme, didn't it? Irreplaceable losses for Japan.
Absolutely. And it ultimately led to Japan deciding to pull out of Guadalcanal. The losses were just unsustainable. Logistics were impossible. Toll highlights the fierce arguments between the Japanese Army and Navy over the decision, even the emperor expressing displeasure. The state of the Japanese troops evacuated was horrific. Yet General Patch, the U.S. commander who took over, felt swindled when he realized the Tokyo Express nighttime runs had pulled most of them out before his final push.
And Yamamoto himself basically admitted they were losing the air war. Pilot losses were crippling the effectiveness of the Zero fighter.
Yeah, the tide was definitely turning, but the fighting spread beyond the islands. What about the home fronts?
Well, Toll covers the friendly invasion of Australia. Nearly 1 million U.S. servicemen pouring in caused quite a culture clash.
I bet.
Alex Haley later wrote, Roots was apparently quite popular writing love letters for his shipmates trying to impress Australian women. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Tensions flared up like the Battle of Brisbane.
A literal battle.
Pretty much. A huge street brawl in November 42 between U.S. servicemen and Australian servicemen and civilians started over some perceived heavy-handedness by American MPs, and tragically, an Australian soldier was killed. It shows the friction that can happen even between allies when you have huge numbers of foreign troops suddenly appear.
Back in the Pacific theater itself, the U.S. Navy was undergoing this incredible regeneration.
Right. Think about Pearl Harbor. Toll describes the massive salvage effort, divers working in unspeakable black sludge inside the sunken battleships, dangerous, grim work. But they raised and repaired many of them.
And new ships were pouring out of the yard.
Exactly. New carriers like the Essex-class, the New Yorktown CV-10, replacing the one lost at Midway. And better planes, the F-6F Hellcat started arriving. Finally a match for the Zero. Despite some teething problems with other new planes like the SB-2C Helldiver dive bomber, American industrial power was really starting to tell.
But they still had that nagging problem, the torpedoes.
Oh, the torpedo scandal. It's infuriating to read about.
Right.
U.S. torpedoes just kept failing, running too deep, faulty magnetic detonators, contact detonators that just didn't detonate.
And the Bureau of Ordnance.
Just stonewalled, Toll says. Blamed the sub-commanders, blamed the fleet maintenance, refused to admit their designs were flawed. It took Admiral Lockwood, commander of submarines in the Pacific, really pushing hard in early 43, making jokes like needing a boat hook to tear plates off enemy ships since the torpedoes wouldn't, to finally force them to fix the problems. Incredible bureaucratic inertia.
Such a contrast with Japan's big failure. Anti-submarine warfare, ASW.
Yeah, Toll identifies this as a fatal flaw. He puts it down partly to the samurai warrior culture.
Yeah.
Offensive warfare was glorious. Defensive stuff like protecting merchant ships was not.
So ASW never got the priority or resources it needed.
Exactly. And American submarines just ran rampant against Japanese merchant shipping, the Maurus. By the end of the war, U.S. subs sank more tonnage than Japan even started with. It crippled their imports, oil, steel, everything. Strangled their whole war economy.
A devastatingly effective campaign, but costly too. U.S. submariners had one of the highest casualty rates.
True. Now, shifting back to the strategic level, the Allies were still arguing amongst themselves. Casablanca Conference, early 43.
British still wanting a minimalist Pacific War, right? Focus on Europe.
Yeah, while the U.S., particularly Admiral King, was pushing for a much bigger commitment, maybe 30% of resources and a faster pace in the Pacific. We mentioned Marshall's frustration with the Mediterranean focus being a suction pump. These weren't settled issues.
But King got his way on pushing the Central Pacific offensive.
He did. He insisted on a hard deadline, which led to targeting the Gilbert Islands' first Operation Galvanic before the Marshalls. And this is where you really see Nimitz's methodical style and Spruance emerging as a key commander, quiet, taciturn, Toll calls him, but very effective. Disciplined planning for a very complex campaign.
Which brings us to Tarawa, November 1943, part of Galvanic, and a really brutal lesson.
Absolutely brutal. The scale of the American fleet arriving was huge. 13 carriers sighted off Betio Island. But the Japanese defenses were incredibly strong. Concrete bunkers, trenches, all designed by Admiral Shibasaki to withstand heavy bombardment. It was a fortress.
And the landings didn't go as planned.
No. The Higgins boats, the main landing craft, got stuck on unexpected coral reefs hundreds of yards offshore. Marines had to wade in under intense machine gun and artillery fire. Horrific casualties just getting ashore.
The fighting was incredibly fierce against those dug-in defenders. Toll does mention, though, that Admiral Shibasaki being killed relatively early in the bombardment probably disrupted the Japanese command quite a bit.
It likely did. But the courage shown by the Marines was just extraordinary. Guys like William D. Hawkins, attacking pillboxes basically on his own, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Yet Toll also captures the fear. Colonel Shoup, another Medal of Honor recipient, yelling about how impossible it was to think with the noise of the bombardment. It's that mix of raw fear and incredible bravery.
And the aftermath. Grimm doesn't begin to cover it.
The fetid stench of death everywhere. Huge numbers of Marine dead, a higher ratio of dead to wounded than usual. The Japanese garrison almost wiped out, only 17 taken prisoner alive, mostly laborers. Holland Smith, the overall Marine commander for the invasion, was apparently shocked and saddened.
And he learned lessons from it.
He did. He bluntly called Tarawa a mistake, arguing the pre-invasion bombardment wasn't effective enough against those defenses and that they desperately needed more LVTs, those tracked amphibious vehicles that could cross the reefs for future landings. Tarawa was a victory, but a very costly one that forced changes.
Toll also weaves in stories from the air war around this time. Damaged planes making incredible landings, like Charlie Cromlin getting back to the Yorktown despite being badly wounded.
And tensions between carrier commanders, too, and that yellow son of a bitch incident.
Oh, yes, Pete Mitchell supposedly saying that about Admiral Pownall, who he felt was being too cautious, not aggressive enough in pursuing the Japanese fleet. Shows the internal friction wasn't just Army versus Navy.
Right. Okay, let's push forward to mid-1944. The Marianas. Operation Forager. And the famous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot.
The scale of U.S. power by this point is just astonishing. Toll mentions the West Lock disaster at Pearl Harbor just before the invasion. 6 LSTs loaded with ammo blew up. A huge loss.
Earlier in the war, that would have been crippling.
Exactly. But by mid-1944, the Pacific Fleet was so abundantly outfitted, as Toll puts it, that they basically shrugged it off and the invasion went ahead on schedule. Just shows the industrial might difference.
Saipan, the first major target in the Marianas, was different from places like Tarawa, though.
Yeah, much larger, rugged terrain, mountains, caves, and, crucially, a large civilian population, Japanese and Chamorro. Plus, Japanese efforts to reinforce were being seriously hampered by those U.S. submarines sinking the transport ships.
Then came the naval battle. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, Task Force 58 versus the Japanese mobile fleet.
And Spruance was in command again. Toll notes his cautious approach, waiting for the Japanese to come to him, keeping Task Force 58 close to protect the Saipan landings. Very different from Halsey's style, maybe more like Admiral Togo at Tsushima, letting the enemy make the mistake.
And the Japanese played right into it.
They did. And this is where American technological superiority really shone. Much better radar, much better fighter direction from the combat information centers, the CICs on the carriers. They could see the Japanese raids coming from much further away and vector the Hellcats out perfectly.
Leading to the turkey shoot.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
June 19th, 1944. Toll describes nearly flawless interceptions. The Japanese strikes were just ill-fated, obliterated. Huge numbers shot down. Many Japanese planes apparently got lost, turned back. Some even shot down by their own side's anti-aircraft fire in the confusion.
There were some incredible individual scores, like Alex Rossiu shooting down 6 planes in one mission.
A fighter pilot's dream, as he put it. Meanwhile, Toll notes Zenji Abe was apparently the only Japanese pilot to actually drop a bomb on a U.S. carrier that day and make it back. Admiral Ozawa, commanding the Japanese fleet, had no idea how bad the losses were initially and launched more strikes the next day, which were also decimated. It was the end of Japanese naval aviation as an effective offensive force.
But even for the victorious Americans, the end of the battle was harrowing.
Yeah, the return flight after pursuing the Japanese fleet late on the second day, pilots flying back in darkness, low on fuel. Toll describes the radio chatter, some pilots sobbing, totally lost. Mitchell made the risky call to turn on the carrier lights to guide them in. Still, many had to ditch in the sea, chaotic landings. A huge victory, but again, a human cost.
And while this is happening, what's going on with Japanese propaganda back home and for the civilians on Saipan?
It's getting increasingly desperate and detached from reality. Toll explains how bad news like Stalingrad, Italy surrendering, was spun as somehow being good fortune. They doubled down on Yamato Damashi, the unique Japanese fighting spirit, and promoting Gyokusai honorable death, mass suicide rather than surrender. Atu and the Aleutians had been an early, grim example.
And the propaganda against Americans was vicious.
Extremely dehumanizing, calling them hairy ones, Anglo-American demons, spreading completely false stories about torture and atrocities. This directly influenced the civilians on Saipan, convincing many that suicide was genuinely preferable to capture, a terrible outcome of state-controlled lies.
Toll includes moments that cut through that, though, like American Marines finding Chamorro girls caught in the fighting and being genuinely distressed, a human connection breaking through the hate.
Yeah. The end on Saipan itself was just horrific. General Saito gave orders for a final massive banzai charge. Soldiers writing last diary entries like the one about becoming whitecaps of the Pacific, and then the mass civilian suicides jumping off cliffs. After the main battle, it took weeks to round up stragglers using loudspeakers, leaflets appealing to them, just a tragedy fueled by fanaticism and propaganda.
And the deception continued back in Japan itself.
Oh yeah. Toll describes the practice of sending families of the dead empty funeral urns, or maybe urns with just a tiny sliver of wood inside, pretending the remains had been recovered. All to keep up morale, hide the scale of the losses.
Censorship was intense.
Orwellian, Toll calls it. Editors being hauled in for humiliating group sessions if they printed anything deemed defeatist. Nationalist papers like Asahi Shimbun were pushing total lies focused entirely on arousing the public spirit, not reporting facts. It created this alternate reality.
But reality eventually intruded, didn't it? The loss of Saipan was a huge blow.
Massive. It directly led to Prime Minister Tojo being forced to resign in July 1944. The military could no longer hide the disasters, but the response wasn't peace overtures. It was doubling down on the Yokusai idea talk of body-crashing attacks, the 100 million smashed jewels, the entire population fighting to the death, even arming civilians with bamboo spears. It shows a leadership utterly trapped in its own ideology, dragging the nation towards catastrophe.
Wow. So pulling this all together from the conquering tide, it's just an incredible picture of a war fought on a scale and under conditions that are hard to fathom. The logistics, the suffering, the innovation.
And the sheer adaptability required, not just from soldiers, but from entire nations. You see how technology, supply lines, leadership, and sometimes the failure of those things just completely shaped how the war unfolded.
Toll really hammers home that gap, doesn't he? Between the rigid dogma of the Japanese high command and the awful reality troops faced, and also the Allies' own internal struggles and how they had to learn and adapt, often painfully.
He does. It's a steep, bloody learning curve on display.
So, thinking about this conquering tide of events and information that Toll lays out, what does it tell you, our listener, about how societies cope or fail to cope with massive, overwhelming change, with extreme pressure?
And maybe think about information itself. How do we distinguish truth from propaganda, especially in tense times? That challenge feels incredibly relevant today, doesn't it?
It really does. We hope you'll reflect on that human element, the role of information, and how the echoes of this conflict still resonate.